They came to move the dead. That was the job, nothing more. In the spring of 1866, the United States Army dispatched reburial crews to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, with a single mandate: locate the Union soldiers buried hastily across the battlefield during and after the fighting in July 1863, and transfer them to the newly established National Cemetery on Cemetery Ridge. It was methodical work, grim work. The men doing it were not historians or archaeologists. They were laborers, most of them veterans themselves, working under the direction of the National Cemetery Commission. They knew what dead men looked like after 3 years in Pennsylvania soil. They knew the smell. They knew the color of the bones. They had a job to do, and they did it without ceremony, section by section, working their way across the fields and ridges and orchards, where 23,000 Union soldiers had fallen in 3 days of fighting that neither side had expected to be decisive, and both had found to be catastrophic. The wheat field was one of the last sections they worked. It had earned its name before the battle, a working farm field owned by a man named David Sherfy, planted with winter wheat that was just beginning to come in when the armies arrived. By July 2, 1863, it had become a killing ground. 6 separate charges and countercharges swept the field in the space of a few hours. The ground was so saturated with blood that soldiers from both sides reported their boots sticking as they walked. When it was over, approximately 4,000 men lay dead or wounded in an area roughly the size of 20 city blocks. The wheat was gone. The field would not produce another crop for 3 years. By the time the reburial crew reached the wheat field in the spring of 1866, the visible dead had long since been addressed in the immediate aftermath of the battle. What remained were the men buried quickly and shallowly by their comrades, by local farmers, by whoever had time and a shovel in the days after the fighting ended. The crew worked systematically, following survey maps that estimated the locations of these hasty burials based on reports collected from soldiers and civilians after the battle. The work was unpleasant but uncomplicated. Standard depth for a field burial in that era was 2 to 4 feet. That was what they expected to find. For most of the wheat field, that was what they found. On the morning of May 4, 1866, one crew working the southeastern corner of the field, the section closest to the Rose Farm, broke through. Not through a coffin, not through a burial shroud, through a layer. The lead excavator's shovel struck something at 4 feet down that didn't give like soil and didn't sound like bone. He cleared the area around the point of contact. What he found was a second surface, organized, deliberate, distinct from the disturbed burial layer above it. Darker soil, older compression, a different kind of arrangement. The standard answer requires a series of coincidences that accumulate past the point where coincidence remains a coherent explanation. The alternative requires only one explanation. There is something under the wheat field that the United States government has been actively suppressing since May 1866, first by placing the National Cemetery above it, then by managing access to the battlefield as a historic site, and now by classifying the results of non-invasive surveys that could confirm or deny what Wendell documented without disturbing a single grave. 158 years. That is how long the suppression has been running. It began with a general arriving in a field and ordering a surveyor to hand over his notes. It continued with the careful maintenance of a national shrine above the evidence. It is still running today, in the form of a classified PDF sitting in a National Park Service server that no member of the public is permitted to read. The last person to speak publicly about what is under the wheat field was James Wendell himself, in the letter he wrote to his wife in June 1866. No one has spoken about it since, not because no one knows, but because the architecture of suppression built above it, 20,000 graves, a national military park, a classified radar survey, and the full weight of American historical memory, has made speaking about it nearly indistinguishable from desecrating the dead. That is not an accident. That is a design. The field exists. The southeastern corner, the one closest to the Rose Farm, where Wendell broke through on the morning of May 4th, 1866, is still there. The rows are still there. The orientation is still there. The dark bones are still there, untouched since rustling ordered the fill soil brought in and the Civil War dead placed above them. And the blades are still there. 41 blades of gray metal that resisted every tool Wendell brought to bear on them, still lying in the same positions, right side of the body, hip to mid-thigh, one per warrior, as sharp as the day they were placed there. Under Pennsylvania soil, under the graves of men who died in 1863, under the most visited battlefield in America, under a classified document that someone in a federal office decided in 2018 that you are not allowed to read. The blades are still there. He called for the survey crew's foreman, a man named James Wendell. James Wendell was 43 years old in the spring of 1866. He had served as a surveyor with the Army of the Potomac during the war, working maps and coordinates under conditions that would have broken most men, and had come through with the kind of precise, methodical temperament that the Commission's work required. He had been measuring things professionally for 20 years. He knew the difference between disturbed soil and undisturbed soil, between a hasty field burial and an organized interment, between a random scatter of bones and a deliberate arrangement. He looked at what the excavator had found, and he made a decision that would cost him his position, his records, and very nearly his reputation. He kept digging. What he found over the next 3 days of careful excavation in the southeastern corner of the wheat field was 41 individuals, arranged in rows, head to foot, in a consistent northeast to southwest orientation that had nothing to do with the topography of the field, and nothing to do with the hasty, practical decisions of soldiers burying their dead under fire. The spacing between individuals was regular, approximately 18 inches between each body. The depth was consistent across all 41, 4 to 5 feet below the surface, meaning they had been buried at roughly the same time, in the same operation, by people who knew what they were doing. The bones were dark, not the grayish-white of bones exposed to air, not the yellowish tint of bones that have been in shallow soil for a few years. Dark brown, almost black in places, the color of wood that has been in the ground for a very long time. Wendell had seen enough battlefield burials to know what 3 years in Pennsylvania soil did to human remains. This was not 3 years. This was not 30. He could not have said, standing there in the wheat field with his surveying equipment and his notebook, how long these individuals had been in the ground, but he knew it was longer than anything he had documented before. He began measuring. The shortest individual in the section he excavated measured 8 feet 1 inch from the base of the skull to the heel. He measured it twice. He had one of his crew members stand beside the skeleton, a man of average height, 5 feet 9 inches, and sketched the comparison in his field notebook. The sketch shows a normal man standing next to bones that extend well past his head when laid flat. The tallest individual Wendell measured was 10 feet 3 inches. He measured 6 individuals in total before the commission's superintendent arrived and ordered him to stop. But before he stopped, he documented one more thing. Every individual in the rows had been buried with a weapon. Always a blade, never an arrowhead, never a point, never a projectile of any kind. Always a blade, always placed along the right side of the body, running parallel from the hip to approximately mid-thigh. The blades varied in length, from roughly 18 inches to just over 3 feet. They were all made from the same material. Wendell described it in his field notes, notes that were later confiscated, but not before he had copied certain observations into a personal letter that survived. As a gray metal, denser than iron, with a surface that showed no oxidation, no rust, no corrosion of any kind, despite what was clearly a very long burial. He tested one of the blades with a file. The file skated off the surface without leaving a mark. He tested it with a steel awl. No mark. He held the blade's edge against a piece of paper from his field notebook and drew it slowly across. The paper cut cleanly. Not snagged, not torn, cut. After an unknown number of centuries in Pennsylvania soil, the blade still held an edge sharp enough to cut paper. Wendell wrote 2 words in his notebook beside that observation. He wrote, "Impossible metal." The bones were extraordinary. The blades were more extraordinary. But the arrangement was what told the real story, and the arrangement was what Wendell kept returning to in the letter he wrote to his wife that June, after he had resigned from the commission and was trying to put into words what he had seen, and what he had been ordered to pretend he hadn't seen. 41 individuals, laid out in military order, each with a blade at the right side. This was not a plague pit. This was not a massacre site. This was not the hurried deposit of bodies by people trying to dispose of the dead quickly before disease set in. The spacing was too regular, the orientation too consistent, the placement of weapons too deliberate. Someone had buried these 41 people with ceremony, with intention, with the understanding that the dead deserved a specific arrangement, a specific orientation, a specific accompaniment for whatever came after death in the belief system of whoever had placed them there. This was a warrior burial. 41 warriors, each between 8 and 10 feet tall, each buried with a blade made from a metal that modern metallurgy cannot easily explain, arranged in precise military rows in a field in Pennsylvania that would not be called the wheat field for an unknown number of centuries after they were placed there. And then, 3 years after the most destructive battle in American history, the Union Army dug a cemetery directly above them, and used the graves of 20,000 soldiers as a lid. Brevet Brigadier General James Wendell arrived at the Wheatfield site on the afternoon of May 6, 1866, 2 days after Wendell's crew broke through the upper burial layer. Wendell was the commission's superintendent, responsible for the overall reburial project. He was a capable administrator and a political animal, the kind of man who understood that his career depended on the smooth completion of a project that was already emotionally and logistically complex. He did not need complications. He did not need a surveyor who had found something under the dead that didn't belong to any American history he recognized. He came down into the excavation with 2 men Wendell had not seen before. They were not commission employees. They were not uniformed. Wendell described them in his letter as civilians attached to the War Department in some capacity I was not informed of. One of them carried a leather satchel. The other carried a camera, a large format wet plate camera of the kind used for field documentation. They photographed the excavation for approximately an hour. They took measurements of their own, separately from Wendell's. Then Wendell told Wendell to hand over his field notes. Wendell refused. Wendell told him again. Wendell said in the letter, "I told him my notes were my professional record, and I would not surrender them without a written order from a superior officer." He produced one. I don't know when he had written it, or whether it was written before he left for the site that morning, but it existed. It had the correct signatures, and it was legal. I handed over the notes. I kept the letter I was writing in my coat pocket. They didn't ask for that. The notes were gone. The photographs taken by the commission's civilian visitors went with them, and with the 2 men in civilian clothes who had arrived carrying a satchel and a camera, and who left with both full. Wendell's order to Wendell was simple. The lower burial layer was to be covered with clean fill soil. The Civil War reburials from the wheat field were to be placed above it, according to the original commission plan. The project was to continue on schedule. The lower layer was not to be described in any official report. If asked, the excavation of the southeastern corner of the wheat field had encountered disturbed geological strata of no historical significance. Wendell wrote, "He wanted me to sign a statement to that effect. I told him I would not. He said my refusal would be noted in my personnel file, and that the commission would not recommend me for future federal employment. I told him I was resigning effective immediately. He said that was my choice to make. I made it." The pages of Wendell's daily administrative journal, covering May 2nd through May 5th, 1866, the days of the discovery and the subsequent order, have been removed from the bound volume. The binding shows the removal clearly. The stubs of the torn pages are visible to anyone who requests the journal from National Archives Record Group 92, Box 217. Rustling did not lose those pages. He did not misplace them. Someone removed them from a bound official government document and left the evidence of the removal in plain sight, either through carelessness or through the confidence of a man who did not believe anyone would ever look. The Adams County Sentinel, the local newspaper serving Gettysburg and the surrounding area, ran a two-sentence item on May 3, 1866, the day before the discovery. Reburial work proceeds at National Cemetery. Some complications in Wheatfield area. No details. No follow-up. The editor of the Sentinel at the time was a man named Henry Stahl, who had covered the battle itself and its aftermath extensively. He knew the significance of anything unusual at the battlefield. He published two sentences and nothing more. Whether he was told something or whether he simply understood that some things were not to be pursued is not documented. What is documented is the silence. James Wendell resigned from the commission in June 1866. He returned to private surveying work in Philadelphia, where he had a practice before the war. He never worked for the federal government again. He died in 1891, 25 years after the Wheatfield, at the age of 68. His letter to his wife, written in June 1866, is held in the Pennsylvania State Archives in Harrisburg in the Wendell Family Papers, donated by his granddaughter in 1947. The letter runs to 7 pages. It describes the discovery in precise professional language, measurements, orientations, materials, and then, at the end, in different handwriting, slightly less controlled, as if written at a different time, perhaps late at night, perhaps after thinking about it for longer than he had intended. It contains a paragraph that no academic paper has ever quoted, because no academic paper has ever engaged seriously with what Wendell documented. He wrote, "I have been a surveyor for 20 years. I have measured walls and foundations and battlefields and the graves of men who died for their country, and the graves of men who died for causes I do not respect. I have always believed that measurements tell truth where words can be adjusted. These measurements tell a truth I do not have the words for. Those were not men of any race or nation I have knowledge of. They were something older than the country I have spent my life mapping. And someone put that country on top of them on purpose. Someone put that country on top of them on purpose." That sentence has been sitting in a Pennsylvania archive since 1947, accessible to any researcher who requests it, cited by no one. The blades are the thread that connects this story to others. Not the bones. Bones can be misidentified, mismeasured, misattributed to disease or deformity, or the exaggerations of untrained observers. The blades cannot be argued away. A blade that resists a steel file and a steel awl, that holds a cutting edge after an unknown number of centuries, that shows no corrosion after burial in Pennsylvania soil. That blade is a physical object with physical properties that demand a physical explanation. The same properties appear elsewhere. In March 1891, the foreman of an iron mining crew in St. Francois County, Missouri, pulled a disc from the chest of a 10-foot skeleton in a sealed granite corridor 310 feet underground. The disc was gray, cold, heavier than iron. It resisted a carbide drill bit without leaving a mark. He called it impossible metal and brought it to the surface in a wool shirt. The company sealed the shaft within 36 hours. In May 1897, a mining owner in Yavapai County, Arizona, descended into a stone corridor beneath his gold mine and found 12 chambers, each containing a shackled skeleton between 15 and 17 feet tall. The shackles were made from a dark metal, heavier than iron, with no signs of corrosion. The chain hooks had been embedded in the stone walls by a process no mining engineer of the period could identify. The owner sold the mine within a week for a third of its market value and moved to Boston, where he spent the next 24 years not talking about Arizona. In November 1879, 8 coal miners in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, 70 miles from Gettysburg, in the same state, in the same geological formation, broke into a sealed copper chamber 180 feet underground. Inside, a figure 9 feet 2 inches tall, armored from throat to shin in seamless gray metal. The metal resisted a sledgehammer. When a miner struck it, it rang like a bell. The federal marshals arrived before the mine superintendent. The chamber was sealed. The company's records were destroyed in a fire. The same gray metal, the same hardness, the same resistance to the tools of the era. Found in Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Arizona. Found in different contexts: a warrior burial, a mining corridor, a sealed chamber, but always the same properties, always in association with individuals who do not fit the recognized history of human beings in North America. This is not coincidence. Coincidence does not produce consistent material properties across 3 separate finds in 3 separate states across 3 separate decades. What produces consistent material properties is a consistent source. Someone made these objects, the blades, the disc, the armor, from the same material, using the same process. That process produced a metal that does not corrode, does not yield to the hardest tools of the 19th century, and does not match anything in the metallurgical record of any known civilization that has been documented in North America. The question is not whether these objects exist. The foreman in Missouri wrapped one in a wool shirt, and his family held it for at least 90 years. The miners in Pennsylvania heard the armor ring when they struck it. Wendell tested the blades with a file and wrote down what happened. The question is, who made them, and how long ago, and what happened to the civilization that produced them? The Smithsonian Institution provides a partial answer, not through what it has said, but through what it has done. Between 1870 and 1920, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology funded and directed dozens of archaeological expeditions across the eastern United States, with particular concentration in the Ohio River Valley, the Appalachian region, and the states of the former Confederacy. The stated purpose was the documentation of Native American burial mounds and cultural sites before industrial development destroyed them. The official reports from these expeditions describe standard findings: pottery, stone tools, ornaments, human remains of typical size. The reports are thorough, professional, and consistent. The newspapers of the same period describe something different. The New York Times, May 1871. Ancient giant found near Brush Creek, Ohio. Smithsonian expedition removes remains. No follow-up. The Smithsonian has no record of the find. The Cincinnati Gazette, August 1875. Burial mound yields unusual remains. Smithsonian representatives present. The article quotes a Smithsonian field agent as confirming the discovery of skeletal material of unusual dimensions. No report was published. The Smithsonian has no record of the expedition. The Charleston News and Courier, September 1871, the same year as the Charleston Custom House discovery. Construction reveals ancient structures. Federal representatives examine site. No details. No follow-up. The Smithsonian has no record. The pattern is consistent across 50 years of newspaper accounts from 17 states. The Smithsonian arrived, the Smithsonian removed something, or directed the removal of something, or oversaw the sealing of something. And then the Smithsonian filed a report describing standard findings that did not include whatever the newspaper had described. This is not a minor gap in the record. Jim Vieira, a researcher who spent 15 years compiling newspaper accounts of giant skeleton discoveries in the United States, identified more than 1,500 newspaper articles from between 1850 and 1920 that described finds of skeletal remains measuring 7 feet or more. These articles came from established newspapers: the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post. They quoted doctors, engineers, government officials, and Smithsonian representatives by name. They described measurements, locations, and associated artifacts. Almost none of this physical evidence exists in any accessible museum or university collection today. Either 1,500 newspapers across 70 years fabricated elaborate, coordinated hoaxes for no discernible reason, or someone systematically removed the evidence those newspapers were describing. The Smithsonian's internal protocol for handling what it called anomalous anthropological materials was formalized in an 1894 document, still partially accessible in the institution's administrative archive, that includes the phrase, documentation with subsequent neutralization. The word neutralization appears in an official Smithsonian document in 1894 and is never defined. What it means in practice can be inferred from the pattern: the evidence documented, the documentation classified, the physical objects removed from any accessible collection, the land sealed or flooded or built over. Gettysburg followed this pattern with a precision that is almost elegant in its thoroughness. The battlefield itself became the mechanism of suppression. You do not need a Delaware-registered LLC to keep people from digging in a national military park. You do not need a surveillance camera at a gate. You do not need FOIA exemptions and classified structural surveys. You need something more powerful than any of those things. You need the dead. 20,000 Union soldiers buried above 41 warriors who predate American history by an unknown number of centuries. 20,000 men who died for a cause that Americans have been arguing about and mourning and commemorating for 160 years. The ground is sacred. The ground is political. The ground is the most protected ground in the country, not by law and not by force, but by the weight of national grief. No one digs under the graves at Gettysburg. No one proposes it. No one would be permitted to propose it. The warrior burial under the wheat field is protected more thoroughly than any sealed mine shaft, more thoroughly than any flooded reservoir, more thoroughly than any concrete plug poured into a Missouri iron shaft at midnight. It is protected by the dead who were placed on top of it. The National Park Service conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey of the wheat field in 2018 as part of an ongoing battlefield preservation and documentation initiative. The survey was performed by a contracted geophysical firm using equipment capable of imaging subsurface features to a depth of approximately 8 feet, sufficient to reach the burial layer Wendell excavated in 1866. The survey report, completed in late 2018, is publicly listed in the National Park Service's FOIA reading room under document identifier NPS-GETT-2018-GPR-04. The report is withheld in full. The exemption cited is 5 U.S.C. Section 552B7F, law enforcement sensitive, records that could reasonably be expected to endanger the life or physical safety of any individual. That exemption exists to protect ongoing investigations, to shield the identities of informants, to prevent the compromise of active criminal cases. It exists to protect people. It does not exist to classify the results of a ground-penetrating radar survey of a 160-year-old Civil War battlefield. And yet, there it is, law enforcement sensitive, applied to a geophysical survey of a field in Pennsylvania where nothing has happened since 1866 except the quiet maintenance of a secret that someone decided, in the spring of that year, was worth burying under the most American thing they could find. A researcher named Catherine Morris filed the initial FOIA request for the survey report in January 2019. She received the withholding notice in April 2019. She filed an appeal in June 2019, arguing that the law enforcement exemption did not apply to archaeological survey data. The appeal was denied in November 2019. The denial letter, which she posted publicly, stated that The release of the requested information could compromise an ongoing matter within the jurisdiction of federal law enforcement. An ongoing matter. In a field where the last event of historical record occurred in 1866. Morris filed a second FOIA request in 2021, this time asking specifically for any records related to subsurface anomalies in the Wheatfield section of Gettysburg National Military Park identified after 2000. The response? Records responsive to your request exist, but are withheld in full under exemptions B1 and B7F. Exemption B1 is national security. The survey data is classified under both national security and law enforcement exemptions. For a radar scan of a farm field. The question that exemption creates is simple, and it does not go away. What is in the ground at Gettysburg that requires a national security classification to keep hidden? The standard answer, that there is nothing, that Wendell was wrong, that his measurements were exaggerated, that the bones he found were the result of a medical condition or a misidentification, does not account for the blades. It does not account for the metal that resisted a steel file. It does not account for Rusling's torn journal pages, or the Commission's civilian visitors with their camera and their satchel, or the Smithsonian representative who arrived within days and whose presence is documented in the administrative record, even though the reason for his visit is not. It does not account for a 2018 ground-penetrating radar survey classified under